Well, it's a big switch to be talking about science in the middle of all the other things that have been going on here. And I think it's important to understand that the science that we have today does not really touch the experience of yoga yet. It doesn't really grasp the experience of yoga, but it has hints, it has inklings of what yoga has to offer. And so tonight I'm going to talk about yoga breathing. Now, the breathing practices in yoga generally fall under the name of pranayama. Now, pranayama is much, much more than breathing. It's the regulation of the energy of the breath. Now, as a scientist, when we say energy, we have a specific meaning for it. But this is not the meaning we use when we talk about breath energy. Yoga is a subjective art. It is felt, it is experienced. And we sense our own life energy, our own life force. And we sense it somehow to be related to the breath. And that is the sense of energy that I'll be talking about this evening. But there is a relation to physical energy. We breathe in air, as we know, in order to get oxygen. And oxygen is used to burn sugar, which is our fuel, to get the energy out of the sugar so our cells in our body can use it. So we need to get oxygen into every cell of the body. And that's quite a feat. But nature has given us lungs to take in air. And the lungs have these tubes. They have bronchi, bronchioles, smaller and smaller tubes. And at the end of these tubes, you find alveoli, which is where the air from the outside that is drawn in meets the blood that circulates throughout the body. And the blood picks up oxygen. It goes from blue deoxygenated blood to red blood. And then it is circulated throughout the body to feed every cell oxygen. But here's something that most yoga practitioners don't realize. When we breathe, the subjective sense we have, the feeling that we want to breathe and the satisfaction that we get from our breath does not come directly from oxygen. No. It comes from carbon dioxide. So down deep in the lungs, there is an exchange of gases. The oxygen is taken into the bloodstream, but the waste products from extracting the energy from blood sugar, the carbon dioxide, is sent into the bloodstream and sent out into the air on each exhalation. And it is that carbon dioxide that gives us our personal sense of breathing from moment to moment. Oxygen only comes into play when we're deprived of it for a long time. So if we are breathing based on the drive of oxygen, we are constantly in a state of stress. When your oxygen level gets so low that it's driving your breath, you're gasping, your heart is pounding, you're sweating. But carbon dioxide gives us that moment-to-moment sense that, oh, it's time to take another breath. We have plenty of time because we're not low on oxygen. We can take it at our leisure. And we do. And this gives us the opportunity when we practice pranayama practices and deliberately regulate our breathing to vary the amount of in-breath, the amount of out-breath. But as Swami Satchidananda so aptly pointed out, we don't really control our breath. We can't really just decide, oh, I'm not going to breathe anymore. If you stop breathing, you can hold your breath and hold your breath and hold your breath, and then you faint, and then you start breathing again. So we are the inheritors of this breath that has come down from our parents. The first thing we do when we are born is we take a breath, right? But before we're born, our parents are breathing, our mother is breathing for us. And her mother before her, and so on and so on and so on. And the breath that we are breathing is one continuous unbroken line that goes back about 3 billion years to when single cells first learned how to use oxygen in an effective way. So we are the inheritors and the guardians of the sacred breath that is billions of years old. And this is what we are regulating or manipulating in pranayama. So we have a precious thing. And for us to assume that we could do something out of the ordinary with it is a great hubris of human beings. We can't go beyond what nature has given us very far. We work within very narrow bounds, but within those bounds, great things can happen. So I'm going to give you a very quick survey of things that can happen in your body from breathing. And these are physical things mostly, but I'll try to work my way up to higher and higher level experiences. Here's an example of a scientific paper that was done on a yoga practitioner, published in 1978. And this person said that he experienced a near samadhi event. And the tracing you see is a record of his breathing pattern. When the tracing goes up, he was breathing in. When the tracing goes down, he was breathing out. And he was breathing quite rapidly, something like Kapalabhati perhaps. And then he got into a very, very rapid breath. Very rapid breath, which shows it's a black mark on the tracing because the strokes of breath were so close together. And then he stopped. He felt that he had somehow seen something beyond the ordinary. And then eventually he started breathing again. Now, as a physiologist, what I see happening from the outside is that he hyperventilated. He breathed out so much carbon dioxide, so much more than his cells could produce, that the level of waste products of carbon dioxide built up in his bloodstream went very, very low. And the drive to breathe, which comes from a place way down low in the brain, down in the lower left side, a place called the chemosensitive zone, that drive to breathe was virtually eliminated for a minute or two. So he has 100 seconds or more in which he's barely breathing at all. But what happened during those 100 seconds? Well, one thing that happens when you lower your carbon dioxide level is your brain's blood vessels squeeze down. They pinch off. They don't want to have that low CO2, that low carbon dioxide level blood circulating through because the brain can be damaged by that in a chemical way. And so the brain is cut off from oxygen, and he had some sort of experience. Whether it was samadhi or near fainting experience, I don't know. But this is one way in which breathing can affect our consciousness. Now, many people believe that when you do a rapid breathing practice, like Kapalabhati, that you're hyperoxygenating your blood and that you're getting lots and lots of oxygen. That's not true either. Our bloodstream in our bodies is capable of carrying a certain amount of blood, and after that it's saturated. That means it's got more than, you can't put any more in. It's like if it rains and rains and the soil becomes saturated with water, you can pour more water on, but it won't go in. So once the bloodstream is saturated with oxygen, you can't get more oxygen in. All of you sitting here, listening right now, are at about 98, 99% oxygen saturation, meaning you're very near the top. So if you breathe fast, after 2 or 3 breaths, you're saturated, that's it. You keep breathing more, the oxygen sort of bounces off your lungs in a way. It just goes in and goes right back out. So you don't get a lot of oxygenation. You get low carbon dioxide, but in that low carbon dioxide state, there is a state of stillness. You don't have the urge to breathe. Think about that. Every few seconds you breathe, morning, noon, and night, wake or sleep. If you can have a minute or two in which you just don't breathe or barely breathe at all, that's a very quiet state of mind. If the nerves in your brain have been pinched, or the blood supply in your brain has been pinched off, your brain goes very quiet, and then the blood slowly comes back, and you see the world anew. So we manipulate our consciousness through such breathing practices. Now, sometimes people practicing yoga will do the opposite. Rather than breathing very hard, very fast, they'll breathe very slowly, very slowly. So there are cases in which people were literally buried, yogis were buried in a box underground and monitored for their physiology and breathed maybe 1 time per minute. And their carbon dioxide level went way, way, way up. What was going on there? Well, we don't know. But here's some evidence related to sleep. When you fall asleep, your carbon dioxide level rises. When you fall asleep, their carbon dioxide level rises. Normally in the day, if the carbon dioxide in your bloodstream rises, you start to feel anxious, you start to feel worried. Well, it rises a little, you start to feel drowsy. It rises a lot, you start to feel anxious. Well, every time you fall asleep, your brain waves change to a sleeping state, and the carbon dioxide level in your bloodstream goes up. Your brain says, oh, before when I was awake, I liked this level. Now when I'm asleep, I like this level. What's happening there? What's interesting, when you sleep, your brain does something different. It's repairing itself. It's regenerating itself. It's restoring and renewing itself. And a high carbon dioxide level opens up the blood vessels in the brain so more blood can flow through. So the change of state of consciousness is directly associated with a change in the breathing pattern, which you can hear anytime you hear someone fall asleep. You hear their breathing change immediately when they fall asleep. And that's associated with a change in the carbon dioxide level, and that's associated with a change in the blood flow through the brain. All these things are related. Now, as I said, as a scientist, that's as far as I go. That doesn't tell me a whole lot about the sophisticated and deep practices of pranayama, but it shows that these practices really do something. An interesting thing happens in yoga breathing, and I experienced this myself. In the early 1980s, I was living in San Francisco. I was a graduate student. Actually, that was about 1980 was the year I first went to the Integral Yoga Institute in San Francisco and took a couple of yoga classes. It was a good experience. But at the same time I was studying, and one of the people I was studying with did a study on people who meditate. She wanted meditators to come in and breathe through this mask. I was one of the meditators. And what she did was she raised our carbon dioxide level while we meditated. And when we were meditating and our carbon dioxide level was raised, we didn't know what was happening, our meditation became deeper and deeper and deeper. Normally, if you raise the CO2 level like that, you get very anxious. But in meditation, somehow the brain was able to switch and enjoy that experience. And so I think back to the yogis who were buried in a box and were able to breathe calmly and a very high carbon dioxide level, and I think maybe there's something there. There's something that we're doing, regulating our consciousness in such a way that we can tolerate a change in carbon dioxide like that. I'm going to move on to something different, quite different, which is the mechanics of breathing. I'm just going to talk about another way that breathing affects our consciousness. So this is a picture of the diaphragm muscle. And the diaphragm moves up and down. And when it moves down, air comes into our lungs and our belly puffs out usually. So many people will say, well, you should breathe diaphragmatically. Puff your belly out, take the belly in, and that is a calming breath. Whereas if you breathe in your chest, if you use these muscles that are up here, in the neck and in the upper chest and between the ribs to make your rib cage heave up and down, that's not a calming breath. That's a breath that makes you feel stressed out. Well, there's some truth to that. When we are breathing with our diaphragm alone, we can supply as much air as we need while we're relaxing. So for you sitting here, you can sit there and breathe only with your diaphragm, get enough air to meet your needs. But if we all decided to go run around the building 5 times, we would all have to use our rib cage as well to get more air in and more air out. So the use of the muscles other than the diaphragm is associated with activity. Now, the greatest activity you're going to experience is if you have an emergency situation, you have to do something very fast. There's a fire, you have to go put it out. There's a tiger in the jungle and you have to run away from it. Something like that, you have to use all of your resources, all of your breath. You have to get maximal oxygen, and you have a fear response that goes with that, a fight or flight response. In the case of the tiger, I'd say flight. And when you have a fight or flight response, you use these accessory muscles of respiration, these neck muscles and upper chest muscles, and a lot of other muscles that aren't shown here. And when you're using those muscles, it is associated in your brain with emergencies. So if you're breathing up there, there's a good chance that you're having some kind of an emergency breathing response, and that's going to be stressful. So when you learn to breathe and make your belly move up and down and not move your rib cage, it has a calming effect because it takes away that emergency breath. However, There's a downside to that. Our lungs should be ready for the emergency. They need to be prepared. The muscles of respiration should be used from time to time. Otherwise, they will get weak, and then when the emergency comes, we won't be able to respond as effectively. So how can we train ourselves to use these emergency muscles and not feel like it's emergency? And here's what you do. You learn to control your carbon dioxide level. And all of you can do that even as you sit and listen. When you breathe, you can feel the breath coming in and out and sense that it has a taste. It has your lungs can taste your breath and can enjoy the breath the way your tongue tastes and enjoys water when you're thirsty or food when you're hungry. The lungs taste the breath and savor the breath. And if you savor the breath and at the same time breathe deep breaths using your full lung capacity, you can keep the mind calm and yet condition your lungs for strong physical activity. Now, there's another effect of deep breaths. When you take a deep breath, because it uses a lot of musculature and for other reasons, it actually stimulates your sympathetic nervous system. While you're breathing in, your heart beats faster and faster. Your sympathetic nervous system makes your heart speed up. The parasympathetic makes the heart slow down. People often say yoga is calming. It slows your heart down. Take deep breaths. But taking a deep breath in during the inhalation stimulates your sympathetic system, turns your parasympathetic system to a lower level, changes the balance between the two so your heart speeds up. But an interesting thing happens at the end of the inhalation. If you take a very deep breath, it stretches the lung tissue. The surface of the lung stretches, and there are nerves in there that sense the stretch, and they send a signal through your vagus nerve, which is a nerve of the parasympathetic system, telling you to exhale. When that vagus nerve signal comes in at the end of the inhalation, it's a calming influence. So at the end of a deep inhalation, even though the inhalation process is activating, you feel a sense of quiet. So when we manipulate our state of awareness by taking deep breaths, we are finding a balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic. And by balancing the in-breath and the out-breath, we create a state of equanimity, which is not totally relaxed, not totally active, but somewhere in the middle. It's sattvic. So breathing can be used to manipulate consciousness in this way. But let's suppose we're interested in using the breath to really calm us down. Taking a deep breath has an activating influence and a quieting influence because of the stretch of the lungs. Take a look at this. Here's a reclining pose in which it's easier to lift the chest. In fact, in the bottom picture, the body is propped up so that the chest is already partway open. The lungs are already partway stretched, and there's no additional effort necessary to stretch the lungs. Now, a normal inhalation in this position will reach the level of stretching the lungs and cause that calming influence to come through the vagus nerve and calm the brain. Remember, when the lungs stretch, it calms the brain at the top of the inhalation. It's just that getting there when in a seated pose, for example, is challenging to the body because you're working against gravity. You're using the accessory muscles a great deal. But here in a reclining pose, especially with the lungs stretched open, you can create a more calming inhalation. Now here's another interesting little fact. In your neck, if you put your fingers to your neck and feel your pulse, you're feeling an area called the carotid sinus. It's where the carotid artery it splits in half. Part of it takes blood into your brain, part of it takes blood out to the outside of the face, scalp, and so forth. In that area, there are sensors that sense your blood pressure. There's similar sensors above your heart in the arch of the aorta. They're shown in red on this diagram here. When you turn upside down, the blood pressure increases in your neck, it increases in your upper chest, stretches those sensors, and it tells your heart your blood pressure is very high, even though it's not. On average, through your whole body, the blood pressure is the same. But locally in the neck, where the sensors live, the blood pressure is high. The body says, oh my goodness, blood pressure is high, better quiet down. It slows the heart rate down, and it calms the brain. There's a direct, or indirect actually, neural link from these blood pressure sensors right up to the very highest points of your brain. The frontal brain slows down, the back of the brain slows down. You can literally measure the brain waves slowing down from turning upside down like this. But another thing, that same reflex that slows your brain quiets the breath. It reduces the amount of it makes your breath very, very quiet. So your breathing it becomes that relaxed kind of breathing that you do when you don't need very much air. You breathe very, very slowly, very lightly. So this is called a baro reflex, and stimulating the baro reflex with inverted postures is one of the unique ways in which yoga helps us both calm our breathing and calm our brain. But take a look at this posture on the screen. This is a supported Satchidananda Sarvangasana, and the chest is stretched open, and the pose is upside down, so gravity is actually making the rib cage drop toward the floor and expand wider. So the lungs are already very, very stretched, and so even a small inhalation stimulates that breathing reflex that quiets your brain still further and quiets your whole sympathetic nervous system still further. So this is an extremely quieting pose. It uses breathing reflexes and blood pressure reflexes together to create a sense of calm. Now, these things were not discovered by yogis in laboratories measuring blood pressure and respiration, blood gases. They were measured by people practicing, experiencing, trying things, and finding out, when I do this, good things happen. And it's for us scientists to come along after the fact and try to figure out what happened. And the more I study it, the more things I discover. This business about the breathing stretch and the lungs, I just realized a couple of years ago. The baro reflex stuff I did work on in the 1980s. It took me all the way to this time to realize that this posture is not just a baro reflex posture. It's not just a blood pressure reflex that calms you in this posture. It's a breathing reflex as well. And there's even more to this posture. When you're upside down like this, and especially if you're upside down like this, the diaphragm has the weight of the abdomen pressing on it. So when you exhale, your exhalation is extended. The contents of the abdomen push on the diaphragm and stretch it toward the lungs. And without effort, you get a deep diaphragmatic exhalation. Remember, exhalation is the breath of relaxation. So here's a third way in which this posture and the previous posture both stimulate relaxation. And just this evening, as I was preparing for this talk, I put two and two together on something that was relatively recent and realized a fourth way that this whole thing might work. Now, bear with me on this one, because this is speculative. Okay, we have a lymphatic system that takes the waste products from between our cells and pumps them up to our heart, back into our bloodstream, where they can be sent out and processed in the liver and so on. So we process waste products in our body through the lymphatic system. The brain has no lymphatic system. How does the brain get rid of its waste products? Just this past fall, it was discovered that the brain, its cerebrospinal fluid, which is the fluid that is inside the brain and outside the brain, has this circulation. And when we fall asleep, and only when we're asleep supposedly, does this fluid circulate freely. The brain cells literally during sleep move apart. There's actually more space between the brain cells, and the cerebrospinal fluid goes through and removes waste product, including potentially the waste product that causes, one of them that causes Alzheimer's disease. This was announced in the journal Science, which is the most prestigious science journal in the world, last fall. This new discovery about sleep. I've been studying sleep since 1975. No one ever knew this up until last year, that during sleep, they call it the glymphatic system. It's not lymph, it's, I don't know where the G comes from, but it's cerebrospinal fluid being circulated through the brain when we're sleeping, and during the wake time it doesn't happen. Now this is where I'm going. How does this relate to breathing in yoga? This is talking about breathing, not about sleep and glymphatic and all that stuff. Well, your cerebrospinal fluid is constantly being produced and constantly drained. You make more, you drain out the old stuff. It goes back into your circulation, sort of like lymph does. Guess what? Cerebrospinal fluid drains only when you're inhaling. So on each inhalation, we move the CSF around. But remember that when you're awake, it doesn't move around very much because the passages are closed. But when you're asleep, it's open. But remember that in breathing, the carbon dioxide level during breathing, during meditation, is similar to the carbon dioxide level when you're asleep. The blood vessels in your brain open up when you're asleep. When you're meditating, just the way they open up when you're asleep, when the carbon dioxide level is high. So why shouldn't the lymphatics open up when you're meditating? Blood vessels open up in your brain due to high CO2 when you're meditating. Blood vessels in your brain open up due to high CO2 during sleep. So doesn't it make sense that perhaps the lymphatics vessels that remove waste products from our brain open up when we're calmly meditating, and then when we're deliberately breathing and we feel these sensations that we feel in pranayama in our head, it feels so refreshing, doesn't it? Have you felt that? You're breathing just right. It feels so refreshing in your brain. Maybe we're moving our lymphatic, our CSF through our brain. We calm the brain by raising our CO2 level, by breathing slowly. We learn to tolerate it by having a meditative state of mind, and we learn to cleanse the brain by breathing with subtlety and sophistication, watching the feelings, following our subjective sense of what is good and right. Speculative, but it makes sense in terms of what we know so far scientifically. And what about inversions? That's going to increase CSF pressure, cerebrospinal fluid pressure. How does that play into this whole picture? I don't know. But it could be that when you do these inversions, another effect of inversions is somehow influencing the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid in your brain, in another way helping to cleanse the waste products in your brain. So this is what science has yet to discover, yet to study. So I don't want to make claims about this. I don't want people to say, oh, Roger says that this is actually how it works. No, this is hypothesis at this point. So the scientific method is we take hypothesis, we do a series of experiments, not just one experiment, and we find out what is true. Some of the things may be true, some not so true, but we'll find out something interesting, no doubt. Alternate nostril breathing. We do alternate nostril breathing, right? And you've heard, perhaps, that breathing through the right nostril is stimulating, the left nostril is quieting. A few years ago, I was at a sleep research conference, and I heard a guy talking about a part of the cerebral cortex, a part of the brain called the insular cortex. Insula means island. It's a little part of the cortex that's sort of an island unto itself. And it's a part of the brain that we use to sense our internal states. And I thought, you know, in yoga, we do a lot of that. We do a lot of sensing our internal states. We notice our carbon dioxide level, we notice our heart, we notice our breathing, we notice our sympathetic system, how stressed we are. All those things are viewed from the point of view of this little part of the brain called the insular cortex. Well, it turns out what these scientists was telling me, telling all of us actually who were at this conference, is the insular cortex is lateralized. That means the left side does one thing and the right side does another. Guess what? The left side stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system. The right side stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. This has not been known for a terribly long time from the scientist's point of view, but the yogis have known that breathing through the left nostril somehow is calming and breathing through the right nostril is somehow stimulating. Perhaps there's a relationship there. The insular cortex is also used to sense a lot of internal states related to respiration. When you have a respiratory distress, you feel like you're not getting enough air, it's sensed in the insular cortex. So why not respiratory pleasure? Couldn't it be sensed there too? Perhaps, but scientists usually study diseases and not pleasure. So we don't know for sure on that. But this is another area of research where science and yoga have an interface. I'm going to talk about one last topic, again speculative, but this one's kind of fun. This is a picture of the Buddha. Of course, Buddha's meditating. He's another great meditative tradition, perhaps probably influenced by the still older yogic tradition. When we meditate, we concentrate our attention. We try to move our prana around, our subjective sense of energy. And sometimes we succeed. And I got to thinking about this in reading BKS Iyengar's work, Light on Pranayama, and he was talking about Mula Bandha. And he said, when the practitioner reaches a state of attempting Mula Bandha, he reaches a crossroads of his destiny. He can go very wrong and misuse the power that he gets from this practice, concentrating this energy, and misuse his power. But the true practitioner loves the divine more than he loves power, and he follows the true path. And what is this thing of using Mula Bandha and concentrating energy? And it's related to the breath. Well, when we practice breathing practices in many systems, including some of the Chinese systems, we do a circulation. So we imagine energy flowing up the back of the spine and down the front of the spine, for example. And these mental practices, any mental event has a neurological correlate. In other words, the nerves in your body do something when you have a mental experience. And what nerves do is they concentrate, they transmit electrical impulses. That's what nerves do. They send signals to one another, electrical signals. So can you concentrate nerve energy? Can it be done? The answer is yes. And the source of my certainty of that is a source that is completely unexpected. Electric eels. Electric eels, you say. Why electric eels? Well, just a few month or two ago, there was a study announced in which scientists realized that electric eels and a number of other animals that have electrical properties that can shock their prey, that can generate these great electric charges. An electric eel can generate 600 volts of electricity. They all evolved differently. They're not all related to each other directly, but they all used some of the same tools of genetics to build their electrical power. And these tools were related to the way nerves transmit electricity. We already have the ability to transmit electricity in our body. Whenever we concentrate on doing something, let's say it's a physical movement, we get a lot of nerves to signal all at the same time. And in that synchrony, they all send electrical impulses at the same time. They can tell a bunch of muscle cells all to contract at the same time, and then we get a very strong movement. This is used in martial arts, and it's used in many disciplines. Whenever you want to generate power, you focus your attention, you get a lot of nerves to all fire at the same time. Well, that's what electric eels do. They just happen to have their nervous system set up in such a way that they can get a lot more nerves firing at the same time than we can. So for an electric eel to send out a charge is like for a person to kick something, or to punch something, or to shout, to build up their energy and let it all out at once. Well, in pranayama, we use our breath. The breath has a rhythm, and the rhythmicity of the breath has this power to recruit and synchronize lots of neurons at the same time. Virtually every part of our brain contains nerve cells that fire in synchronization with our breathing. Virtually every part of our brain. You think about how many things are influenced by our breath or influence our breath. Think of things that influence the breath. If you're frightened, it influences your breath. If you exercise, it changes your breathing. If you are sleepy, it changes your breathing. If you are thinking really hard, it changes your breathing. If you are speaking, of course, it changes your breathing. And all these different things use different parts of the brain. And so just as different parts of the brain can influence the breathing can feed back on all those parts of the brain and get them to work in synchronization. So when we are practicing meditative practices that use the breath as a synchronizing force, even using chanting, which is a form of breath work among other things, we are synchronizing lots of nerve cells to do the work we want them to do. Now, we don't necessarily want to create 600 volts of electricity and create a shock. That's a pretty blunt instrument. We do something much more refined. We take the intelligence, and respecting that intelligence, we get lots of different parts of our brain working in harmony with one another, more like a chorus than like a bunch of people shouting one thing at the same time and raising their fists. It's a much more peaceful use and a much more subtle use and delicate, but able to do great things. So I've just surveyed a whole list of ways in which the science of breathing and the art of pranayama either are known to interface or may interface. And I hope what you get from this is that we have a very powerful practice here. And as practitioners, if you're not inclined towards science, you don't have to study the science. You don't have to understand the science to be a great practitioner of these arts. The art, in this case, leads the science. You practice, you become present, you do what needs to be done in your practice, and follow the moment. And leave it to those inclined towards science to figure out how you did it when you do something great. Thank you very much.